Pokrovsk is a small town in regard of Ukraine, yet it is the place of one of the most gigantic battles of this war. I can divide the Battle of Pokrovsk into four distinct phases. The first phase began late autumn 2024 with the Russians advancing to the town's southern approaches. This phase had been terminated with a last-minute Ukrainian counterattack near Udachnya and Katlina in February 2025, by which they managed to fend off the Russian encirclement attack from the south in the very last moment. They utilized the choke points behind the advancing Russian units. The second phase began in spring 2025 with the Russian operational breakthrough between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. The Russians managed to close in on the eastern approaches of Pokrovsk near Novoekonomice. The Russians continued this phase and they tried to win the battle for the Suvorova salient, hence it was the decisive point of the battle for Pokrovsk. But by the end of the first week of August, the Ukrainians won the tactical engagement at the Suvorova salient. The third phase began right after the Russians realized that their advance had been halted at the northern perimeter of Pokrovsk in the battle for the Suvorova salient. In this phase, they have pivoted the 51st Combined Arms Army's main direction of attack with almost 90 degrees in 24 hours, which is a remarkable feat in itself. What is even more remarkable is the new infiltration procedure that the Russians started to employ in this operation. With this, they managed to reach dozens of kilometers into the Ukrainian defenses, and they caused chaos on a ground scale. This Russian salient near Zaloty Kalodyaz and Kucherev Yar prompted hasty but decisive Ukrainian reactions, and the Ukrainians have managed to contain the Russian advance and subsequently eliminate the threat that these forces posed. I made a video of this operation. I put the link in the upper right-hand corner and also in the description. But the Russians still had their strongest ace up in their sleeve. The Kucherev Yar salient had not yet been eliminated by the Ukrainians. The Russians commenced their fourth phase. They shifted their center of gravity once more and pivoted the 51st Combined Arms Army, now supported with the attacks of the 2nd Guard Combined Arms Army from the south. From the second week of October, they deployed infiltrating infantry small units near the Suvorova salient, and by the 26th they managed to capture the salient and they even managed to set their feet in the town of Radinska. This town obtains a key importance in the defense of Pokrovsk. On the 27th of October, I already wrote on my Substack page, which link is also in the description, that the Russians will hold the area of Radinska as an anvil, and they will continue their infiltration attempts from the south as the hammer, thus trapping the Ukrainian units still in and around the town. I also wrote that the Ukrainians should immediately withdraw their forces from Mirnograd and retain their first line of own troops to the Pokrovsk center, Svitle-Radinska line. But the world doesn't function according to my wishes, and what is a lot more sad, also not by clear logic. Thus in this video I will present you the epic final phase of the Battle of Pokrovsk. In this phase we can closely examine the new Russian infiltration methods and how the Ukrainian strategic and political leadership sacrificed their best quality forces for absolutely no good reason. If you think my job worth it, please give this video a like and subscribe to my channel. If you have anything to add, I am more than happy to see it in the comments. And now, let's begin. As I mentioned above, the Russians employed infiltration procedures on a ground scale. Of course, in itself there is nothing new in it. The Russian military is widely known and renowned from its tried and tested infiltration tactics. It is not the first time that they use it in this year either. As I mentioned above, they managed to create the Kucherev Yar salient with infiltrating infantry small units back in August this year. At that time, some misfortunate Russian soldiers tried to use even some kind of a thermal camouflaging poncho, but they have been hunted and killed by Ukrainian drones. However, I consider it as a battlefield test because in the era of sensor-saturated battlefield, most of the events can be seen on drone footage. However, what is more important that we can't see only its results, because it means that it had managed to evade the drones and other sensors. Because the key to any successful infiltration is the concealment and camouflage. Of course, the personal camouflage is very important. You have to fix your gear and eliminate all the noises and shiny objects. You must also consider turning off all electronic devices, and must employ camouflage measures in the infrared spectrum also, mainly with the above-mentioned thermal ponchos. Next to the individual camo, the concealment of the troop movements is another feature of key importance. During the infiltration, the executing subunits or individuals must avoid detection by using the concealment features of the terrain. These features are usually dense vegetation and man-made objects such as buildings, tunnels, or most commonly in urban areas, the underground systems such as canals, mining tunnels, or subways. We have already seen some examples of this in this war. In this actual situation, it will be interesting to observe the success rate of the Russian infiltration attempts after they have managed to set their feet inside the built-up areas. The new element of the Russian infiltration tactics in this battle was the goal of which they deployed these forces. Infiltration is usually executed as a method to deploy recon or special forces subunits behind enemy lines where they intend to stay undetected. In this battle, the Russians used the infiltration as a key element of the decisive effort. But what I mean? The Russians deployed 1 to 3 man-strong infantry subunits. Their most important task was to evade the Ukrainian strongpoints and exploit the gaps in the Ukrainian lines caused by manpower shortages, and reach the designated area where they had to hide. When enough force had reached the designated area, I mean about 4 to 8 men, they tried to execute raids against Ukrainian drone or mortar teams, or they tried to execute ambushes on logistics. With this method, the Russians achieved 3 important goals. 1. They managed to cause chaotic situations behind the tactical depths of the Ukrainians. 2. They also managed to push the most important Ukrainian fire support elements out from large parts of the town. And 3. By evading the Ukrainian strongpoints, they largely managed to evade or at least reduce the bloody close-quarters combat common feature of urban operations. However, I must highlight that all of this was made possible by the huge gaps in the Ukrainian lines caused by chronic manpower shortages. But what is even more important, that with this procedure the Russians had changed the whole nature of urban operations, which was largely unchanged since Stalingrad. Instead of the bloodbath, they turned it into a tactical level anti-access area denial struggle, where the warring parties tried to push each other's infantry and fire support elements out from the town by deploying their own infantry small units and fire support element against the enemy's high-value targets. This is something very new in regard of military science. The area of operation consists of 3 well-distinguishable parts. Number 1 is the town of Pokrovsk in itself. Number 2 is the town of Mirnograd and its immediate surroundings. From now on, we will call it the Mirnograd pocket. And number 3 is the town of Radinska and the Suvorova salient. As I mentioned above, by capturing Radinska and practically controlling the Suvorova salient, the Russians created the anvil, while the offensive efforts from the south were the hammer. We pick up the thread of the events on the 26th of October. So, on the 26th, the Russians captured Radinska, thus creating an unfavorable situation for the Ukrainians in the Mirnograd pocket. Of course, it has not been cut physically, but the only remaining supply route to Mirnograd came under immense pressure from Russian drones and the drone-adjusted artillery. My guesstimates, based on open sources and eyewitness accounts, is that approximately 80% of the vehicles had been hit moving on this route. This forced the Ukrainians to create an air bridge by drones and to use the underground facilities if they existed at all. On this day, the best solution would have been for the Ukrainians to withdraw to the above-mentioned Pokrovsk-Rivne-Radinska line, but due to idiotic political intervention it didn't happen. But before that, I assume that the Russians assumed that the Ukrainians will weaken their positions at the eastern edge, and they launched a tentative attack with 2 BMPs near the village of Balahan. The 2 BMPs had been destroyed, but it doesn't mean that the infantry didn't make it. Deducting from the lack of videos, I assume that the Russian infantry managed to hide in the nearby buildings. Albeit by the orders of incompetent political leadership, the last 3 days of October had been spent with the planning and preparations of a counterattack. It was crystal clear that in order to salvage the situation, the Ukrainians must recapture Radzinsk. On the 31st of October, reports came that the Ukrainian main intelligence directorate, the HUR Special Forces, launched a counterattack against the Russian positions in Radzinsk. We don't know much about this operation, which is a remarkable feat in the sensor-saturated battlefield. However, what we know that on the 1st and 2nd of November, Russian artillery heavily pounded the central and northern parts of the town, from which I deduct that the Ukrainians managed to clear these parts of the settlement from the Russians. But in the last days of October, this success at Radzinsk has been overshadowed by a daring air assault which caused an immense noise, which of course hampered its clear understanding. First of all, we have to understand why it had happened. As a military leader, your first and foremost task during planning is to ensure the overwhelming superiority of your subordinates conducting their mission. In order to do so, you must assess the available resources and the balance of forces ratio. It turned out that the Ukrainians already had approximately a company worth of the 425th Skala Assault Regiment in the town. But it was also clear from the steady Russian infiltration that they are not enough to launch any kind of counterattacks, so further reinforcements were needed, and these reinforcements had to be somehow deployed into Pokrovsk. Troop movements on ground vehicles was out of question because of the obvious drone peril. Slowly but surely tickling forces into the town by infiltration was also out of question due to the possible high casualties and the slow nature of it, so the Ukrainians had to think outside of the box. It wasn't the first time in this war when they used transport helicopters for a purpose like this. The most famous is the so-called Mariupol air bridge when they used Mi-8 helicopters to evacuate wounded and infiltrate key personnel. Less commonly known operation was in this spring 2025, where they executed a heli-borne raid into the Belgorod region of Russia with limited results. They also deployed special forces by helicopters east of Kupiansk, trying to disrupt the logistics of the Russian bridgehead west of the Oskil River. Albeit, the helicopters themselves became pretty vulnerable near the front lines, the attack helicopters' role have been 100% taken over by drones. But the element of surprise and the transport helicopter's capacity to transport dozens of soldiers with relatively high speed made them a surprising but logical choice. In order to support an air assault mission, the enemy air defense should be suppressed, but here the Russians completely lacked it. Albeit, what could not be suppressed is at least one Russian drone which was idling in an ambush position next to the M30 highway. Its camera captured two UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters. Later, another footage had been appeared which was taken by local residents, allegedly. The biggest problem with these pictures is that we can see well. I mean, we can see a clear sky and the rising sun in the morning. These are not ideal weather conditions for a helicopter infiltration. These pictures have been taken by me in summer of 2017 above Kosovo at a similar exercise. Emphasis on the exercise. This picture, however, had been taken of my platoon and me in Iraq 2015, just before a mission which was definitely not an exercise. It is easy to see that it had happened at night. What I wanted to say is that flying into the hornet's nest in a clear morning is not a good idea. I assume that this had happened due to a great haste and due to a lack of nocturnal training. From open sources, we have clear evidence of only one heli landing site, or if you like, HLS. It was exactly here where these pictures had been taken by Russian drones. And if you are a Ukrainian high-value target seen by Russian drones, it usually has grave consequences. Altogether, 11 soldiers had been deployed here. Right after getting out of the chopper, the Ukrainians assaulted the buildings of the industrial area right in front of them and tried to grab a foothold there. But in the coming minutes and hours, Russian FPV kamikaze drones equipped with thermal optics wreaked havoc on them. According to openly available footage, 4 or 5 Ukrainian soldiers have been hit of the 11-strong team. But we have direct evidence of another helicopter and circumstantial evidence of another third helicopter. The circumstantial evidence is that on the 29th, 30th, and 31st of October, Ukrainian infantry cleared the northern part of Pokrovsk of Russian forces. Hey, hold on for a minute. If this is true, and this is true, hence we have video evidence, then it means that by the last days of October, the Russians advanced a lot more than the first line of own troops is marked on my map. I assume that by the 29th, the Russian infiltration teams reached up to this line. But we also know that on the 29th and on the 30th, these Ukrainian HUR Special Forces groups cleared the northern part of Pokrovsk and commenced pushing south. It means that if we calculate with 11 soldiers on each helicopters, I assume that 3 helicopters have landed altogether, approximately on these heli-landing sites. So as I said, from there they commenced advancing south, thus creating favorable conditions to deploy at least a company worth of forces of the 425th Skala Assault Regiment. I don't even know how they got there, but their presence is proven. Could there be another, even larger scale helicopter infiltration? Or they have been arrived using underground facilities? Or simply the air assault drew away the Russians' attention? We don't know it yet, but as I said, in the era of sensor-saturated battlefield, it is what we didn't see makes a difference. All in all, the Ukrainians deployed their elite light infantry forces, and after 3 days of intense fighting, they managed to push back the Russian infiltrators to the railway line and the train station itself. One infantry squad has even managed to plant the flag at the city council building, but I assume it was just a daring PR stunt with no meaningful tactical gains. Remember, the 1st of November was the day by which the Ukrainians had also managed to partially recapture Radinska. It seems to me that 4 days after the Russians practically cut the Mirnograd pocket, the Ukrainian operational and tactical level commanders and staff officers planned, organized, and executed a brilliant but desperate effort to provide the opportunity the 38th Marines to withdraw. But it also seems that the Ukrainian strategic and political leadership didn't decide to save what can be saved: madness and stupidity. On the 2nd of November, the Ukrainians heavily hit the mining complex in the center of the Suvorova salient, hence it was an ideal hiding place and staging area for Russian infantry, but the Russians also used all available means to retain the initiative. Still, on the 2nd of November, Russian infiltration teams have been spotted at the eastern perimeter of Radinska, at the industrial complex in the northwestern corner of Pokrovsk, and in the northern part of the town in a suburban area. These 2 to 3 men strong Russian infantry small units masterfully avoided the Ukrainian troops, or even they hid away some days ago during the Ukrainian counterattack. We don't know it for sure. What we know is that they got drone strikes from the Ukrainians, but they were a clear sign of renewed Russian attempts. On the next day, Russian infiltration teams have been spotted west of a mining complex in the southmost edge of the Mirnograd pocket and at a petrol station south of Rivne. The latter had been eliminated, but the former meant that the Russians gained a foothold here, using the mine and the nearby industrial buildings. Also on the 3rd, I assume that the Russians attempted to recapture Radinska. At least, this is my deduction, based on that the Ukrainians deployed armored vehicles, and one BTR-4 APC had been hit inside the town, and they even called for closer support, and a JDAM strike had been carried out against Russians in the center of the town. On the 4th of November, the Russians attempted to quickly penetrate Mirnograd on motorcycles from the northeast, but it had also failed. However, in the northwestern corner, the infiltration attempts were more fruitful. Some Russian soldiers have been spotted here and were subsequently hit by drones of the Skala regiment. Now it became crystal clear that the drone density rendered all types of attacks useless, and only the infiltration procedures could yield some gains. This latter engagement in the northwestern corner must have been a part of a larger tactical operation, because by the end of the day, the whole industrial complex had been recaptured by a group of HUR special forces. By the end of the 4th, the Ukrainian forces still had a firm grip on the northern part of Pokrovsk. The Russians, however, didn't give up, quite the contrary. On the 5th, They attempted to recapture the train station as one of the tactically most important objectives, but their infantry had been spotted and hit by drones a couple of blocks south of it. The drones made logistics a nightmare. The Russians tried to employ BMPs with additional anti-drone armor, but most of them have been destroyed. Two of this type have been hit near Razinya on this day, which presents us that both warring parties could hit way behind each other's first line of own troops. On the 6th of November, Ukrainian drones observed Russian infantry disembarking pickup trucks in Hnatyivka. They unloaded not just infantry but precious logistics, and they did it very calmly. All of it means that the Ukrainians, however, could effectively counter the Russian infantry in the town, but they didn't have the resources to step up in the A2AD contest, which this operation became. They couldn't hamper the Russians feeding troops and logistics into the battle. And it clearly showed its significance on the same day, when Russian infantry has been spotted south of Rivne, and they also managed to infiltrate the industrial complex in the northwestern corner for I don't know how many times. Also on the 6th of November, another interesting event happened. Ukrainian drones destroyed a PRP-4M NARD artillery reconnaissance vehicle east of Mirnograd, right here at the technical obstacles. Probably it hit a mine, then it had been dismantled by drones. What is more interesting that why on earth the Russians sent a vehicle like this here, when drones can provide a far better observation and adjustment of artillery fire. On the 7th of November, Russian infiltration teams have been hit by Ukrainian drones 1.5 kilometers south of Radinska. I assume that they came from the area of Chervony Liman or from Radinska itself, trying to envelop the Ukrainian positions in the center and northern part of Radinska. Also on the 7th, more important events happened. The eastern edge of the Ukrainian positions in Mirnograd received a particularly heavy assault. The infantry have been supported by the usual drone and artillery strikes, and some heavily fortified positions have been hit with Kornet ATGMs. However, this operation wasn't an individual attempt, but it was a part of a coordinated effort. On this day, Russian infantry took positions in the northeastern part of the town and also in the center of the southern half of the urban area. By the end of the day, the Ukrainians have been pushed back to approximately this line, but they should watch their back because Russian infiltrators could appear anywhere and at any time. On the 8th of November, the Russians intensified their efforts in Pokrovsk also. Russian infantry was spotted and hit at the western perimeter of the train station. Russian quasi-FOB, or just a group of careless infantry, have been hit at the southwestern corner by Ukrainian artillery. Also on the 8th, Russian infantry have been hit in the southeastern part of Radinska and in the southern part of Mirnograd. This latter have been supported by glide bombs also. I can deduct from all these events that on the 7th and even on the 8th of November, the Russians elevated the pressure on the Ukrainians, trying to break their resistance. We don't have any open source info from the 9th, but on the 10th of November, the Russians have planted their flag in Hnatyivka, which has served purely PR purposes, hence it has already been controlled by them for almost a week. What is more important that a group of motorcyclists have been hit by Ukrainian drones on the street right here. But it seems that this successful drone strike was just a single event, because on this day videos appeared from the Russian infantry moving into Pokrovsk. Yes, it was the infamous Mad Max style video. Of course, it is laughable from one side. That is not a picture of a world-beating armed force what the Russians want us to imagine them. But this way the Russians can relatively cheaply saturate the Ukrainian targeting system. So, if it is stupid but works, it ain't stupid. I would like to also draw your attention to the shotguns. According to Battlefield Info, they are pretty effective against FPV drones as a last-ditch effort. Also on the 10th of November, the Ukrainians sent a single tank with drone support to wipe out the Russian positions in the southern parts of Radinska. On the 11th, a Russian unmanned ground vehicle, a UGV, has hit a remotely laid mine in Zvirove. Seemingly, it has nothing to do with the tactical engagement in the town, but I would like to highlight this as one of the rare events when the Ukrainians mined the approaches of the town, acting according to the new A2AD procedures of urban warfighting. Also, by the end of the day, it was clear that the Russian infiltrators managed to reach this line in Pokrovsk. This statement of mine is retrospectively supported by the events of the next day. On the 12th, the Ukrainians tried to improve their situation. Infantry small units of the Skala regiment cleared the industrial buildings once more. And also on this day, Russian positions received heavy drone strikes in Rivne, but as far as I know, they managed to hold their position. On the 13th, the Ukrainians deployed altogether a company worth of highly skilled infantry of the SBU and the 425th, heavily supported by drones to clear the northern part of Pokrovsk. On the 13th, soldiers of the 425th Skala Regiment, heavily supported by the drones of the 79th Air Assault Brigade, cleared the immediate southern surroundings of the train station. Also on the 13th, Russian positions have been heavily hit by drones of the 68th Jaeger Brigade in the eastern part of Pokrovsk. These latter positions of the Russians have been firmly held by them, which is main reason can be that this part of the town didn't receive Ukrainian infantry attacks. Because by this time it became crystal clear that drone attacks alone cannot stop the Russians. Only a concentrated effort of infantry and drones can achieve results. This Ukrainian counterattack proved to be a large one. Still on the 13th, a platoon of the 425th Regiment had been seen dismounting APCs at the western perimeter of Radinska. Later, reports came of heavy fighting in the center of the town. This Ukrainian counterattack had reached the results of the previous. Cleared the northern half of Pokrovsk, pushed back the Russian efforts in Radinska, and provided the opportunity to withdraw the trapped 38th Marines from Mirnograd. But it didn't happen. Again. The Ukrainian High Command wasted 2 weeks and hundreds of human lives for absolutely nothing. On the 14th, Russians have captured a larger part of the southern half of Mirnograd, and they re-intensified their infiltration efforts in Pokrovsk. On the 15th, Russian troops have been hit by artillery of the 155th Mechanized Infantry Brigade at the spot of the former HLS-1. On the 16th of November, Russian infantry have been spotted 1 kilometer north of Pokrovsk. According to open sources, the Russians reached this line by the end of the 17th, so I consider the 17th of November the day of the fall of Pokrovsk itself. At the data cutoff day of this video, which is the 18th of November, the Battle of Pokrovsk is still raging on. The 38th Marines are still in Mirnograd for no good reason. And precisely because of this, Radinska is still a place of heavy fighting. Well, what can I say as closing remarks? From the point of view of the military science, we have seen a shockingly new procedure of capturing an urban area. Instead of what we have seen in Stalingrad, Berlin, or even since in Grozny, Fallujah, or even in Mariupol or Bakhmut, it is totally different. Instead of concentrating against each other's forces, the warring parties try to evade them. Urban operations became a tactical level A2AD effort, where the infantry small units and fire support elements of the warring parties try to push the enemy's drone units out from the town and push the artillery away from it. They also try to cut the logistic ties of the forces fighting in the urban area by attacking the approaches of the built-up area with drones, artillery, and remote mining. From the military decision-making point of view, it was a clear Ukrainian tragedy. I accept that according to Robert Magyar Brovdy, more than 9,000 Russians have died for Pokrovsk because he has video evidence on this claim. But the other side of the coin is that according to my estimates, approximately 2 brigades worth of forces have been lost at the Ukrainian side. This ratio is not good enough for the Ukrainians. The symbolical meaning further worsened the situation. Because Pokrovsk became a symbol as Bakhmut, the Ukrainian political and strategic command committed too much resources to defend the town. Deep, fortified defenses should have been prepared northwest of Pokrovsk months ago. I don't know if it had been begun to be constructed at all. Instead of it, the Ukrainian High Command left the 38th Marines in the trap, while they fed one of, if not the best quality infantry in the world into the meat grinder to push back the Russians. This is a very bad message for the troops. Well, that is all that I wanted to say for now. Thank you very much for your time and attention. If you have anything to add, I am more than happy to see it in the comments. If you see my job worth it, please give this video a like, subscribe to my channel and share it. Thank you and see you soon.